Hi guys, welcome back to the Social Tune. And on today's episode of Record Roundup, we're heading back towards a pool of quality. Because after all, for as bad as some episodes are, there are some truly excellent and pivotal albums that have been released these past few weeks. And there are still plenty that I need to check out before the year's end so I can put my year-end list together. So let's not waste any more time and dive into the newest album by Annie Clark herself.
How can anybody have you? How can anybody have you and lose you? How can anybody have you and lose you? Not lose their minds too.
You know, I didn't actually hear any of the lead-off singles for this. In fact, I didn't even get any requests for it up until about a week ago. So I actually ended up finding out about this album because it was being advertised on the window of my local record shop. And of course, I was instantly intrigued because I love St. Vincent. She's an incredible personality and, in my opinion, what many people thought Lady Gaga was set to become a few years ago. Weird and experimental, defiantly blowing through taboos, and overall an artist who deserves to go down in history as one of the true greats. And even though I didn't absolutely adore her last album as much as everyone else seemed to, I was still definitely intrigued going into this, as it was reportedly her most personal album to date, exploring the concept of power. Well, to absolutely no one's surprise, the album is excellent. But the question now becomes just how excellent it is, because the critical scene seems to be on the fence about it. Some have said that the experimentation from her last album is sorely missed, others have compared it to David Bowie, and yet others have praised it to high heaven, but haven't found it quite as potent as some of her best work. Now, personally, I still think there's plenty of experimentation here, as the production on some of these songs feels downright futuristic, and yet still caught up in the bright musical neon that reminds me of the 80s. Which is reflected in the ballads like New York and Happy Birthday Johnny, both of which showcase just how beautiful Annie's voice is. These two also stand out because of their much cleaner production compared to the warping instrumentation of the rest of these tracks, which contain industrial bass, squealing electric guitars, and punching synthesizers, with the absolute best example of these coming on Los Ageless. I've said before that I love songs about the vapidity of LA, and this song is one of the best examples of that, as it dives into the duality of the power that beauty and youth gives you when in LA, as well as the people's obsession with preserving them, and in fact that their youth is squandered as Annie Clark screams out, "How could anybody have you and lose you and not lose their minds?" And that underside of power, if you will, is a running theme throughout this album. Pills explores how we take medication for everything to strengthen ourselves and yet also become dependent on them. Sugarboy explores her relationship with this young, sweet, innocent boy who nevertheless does have power over her despite probably not wanting it. Happy Birthday Johnny shows a character from her last album showing up at her door with a heroin addiction, accusing St. Vincent of not using her power for good and acting all high and mighty, but then she points out that she's not able to help him until he's ready to take action himself. But the most blatant example of this is Savior, which is placed right at the center point of this album and explores the relationship between a dominatrix and a masochist. And I love how she points out how she, the dominatrix, is technically bending to his will as she's doing what he wants. And when she tries to break out of that role, he calls her out on it, accusing her of acting righteously, once again showing who's really in control. And it's this incompleteness of power that Annie Clark is trying to fill, which she finally does on Smoking Section. As she finally finds a way to fill that void, actually surrendering her power, giving herself entirely to another human being, and experiencing a whole new emotion, love. Now, if that sounds corny to you, I get that. But personally, seeing this character obsessed with power seek it through all these powerful channels across this album, to end up settling for actually giving up that power in favor of experiencing something entirely new, that's incredibly poetic to me. And while I'm not quite sure yet if I'd call it her best album, it's still a wonderfully seductive, sexy, yet warping and mutating listen that is definitely an experience. And personally, I was absolutely enthralled from beginning to end. 9 out of 10, once again, Annie Clark, yet another essential listen to your name. At this point, I really shouldn't be surprised, and yet you just keep on blowing my mind. Great work. So, critical darling Chelsea Wolfe, once a folk singer, now a weird blend of folk and doom metal that have had many calling her one of the most progressive artists working today. Now, like pretty much everyone, I really do admire her. She's got great pipes, her songwriting is ethereal and paints haunting pictures, and she's got a love for darkness and experimentation that I definitely share. And all of that culminated in 2015's Abyss, which was her darkest and bleakest project to date, about someone hovering on the edge of a dark, mysterious abyss and finally falling into it. It was dark, it was gothic, it was praised by pretty much everyone, and I couldn't get into it as much as I wanted to. Oh, I tried, but unlike some other albums like Autumn Eternal by Panopticon or songs like Guantanamo by Violin, I always found that I appreciated the aesthetic and the artistry involved, and yet it just refused to suck me in entirely. I see that it's dark and experimental. I completely understand why so many people adore it. But for me, it just left me a little cold. It wasn't a true experience. So, cut to 2 years later with this album, and I was really excited. For one, this album was said to be much more personal lyrically, which could only be a good thing, and the instrumentation was veering more towards doom metal than ever before. Perfect, this should be right up my alley. And for the first week or so, I absolutely loved everything about it. But by week 2, I was starting to notice some flaws. And at this point, a month after its initial release, I think I've finally come to my conclusion. This album is lyrically chilling, and the instrumentals are even darker than they were on Abyss. But the problem is that they're not all that different. To me, the more I listened to this, the more it felt like more of the same, with only 1 or 2 slight differences. One of which, of course, being the lyrics, which are reflective of Chelsea Wolfe's own tragic life, having her innocence ripped away from her at a young age. And while it is definitely chilling, it also doesn't really go into much detail. The lyrics are kept rather vague, which I get. It's hard for her to talk about, which is why her vocal performance is so crucial, as it serves to drive a lot of the emotional stakes. And look, she does a great job, but the more I listened to it, the more I lost interest. And a lot of that, unfortunately, has to do with the production. Because frankly, this album is slow. Seriously, it's under 50 minutes and feels more like 2 hours. And that's because the instrumentation doesn't really switch up enough in terms of sound or tempo. It all just kind of blends together. Which may have been the point, but it's all meant to build towards that big final climax. And frankly, once the final track Scrape rolls around and Kelsey's vocals rise in pitch, it's definitely great, but it's also really short, and after all that build-up, I guess I was just expecting a bigger and longer payoff. Now look, I know that this is a contentious opinion, and I also know that Chelsea Wolfe clearly gave this her all. But I'm also not going to sit here and lie to you guys that I love this album, when in reality, it's one that I admire more than I outright love. So it's an extremely strong 7 out of 10, but there is room for improvement. I know that many of you are going to be angry about this, and feel free to post about it down in the comments. But save some of that rage for later, because trust me, we're not done yet.
Close your eyes and you're gone. Dreams.
Beck, one of the most beloved and influential acts in music. If you go back to the 90s and early 2000s, this guy was a god. He was someone who loved experimenting with so many different styles, from folk to country to hip-hop to funk. Now, personally, while I never bought into him entirely, I definitely do like and admire him. He's had some missteps, but he's never made a bad album, and in my opinion, his best work came around the turn of the century with Midnight Vultures and Sea Change, both very different and fantastic classics. Now granted, his last album Morning Phase, which won Album of the Year at the Grammys, was not my favourite of his. Definitely good, just not great in my opinion. So with this next album, I wasn't sure what to expect. Either way, it certainly wasn't what I got here. This is a weird affair, definitely still indie, but also the closest thing to pop that I've ever heard from Beck. And boy is it a mixed bag. This album isn't precisely bad, but I would say that it's definitely Beck's weakest release, at least in a really long time. And the main reason, unfortunately, is that Beck himself isn't really much of a presence on this album. Oh, he clearly arrives ready to experiment on some of the songs here, like Colors and both versions of Dreams, but on a lot of these other songs, like I'm So Free and No Distraction, you could swap him out for any generic unknown male singer and they'd probably do about as well. And being more pop-oriented, the lyrics and production here are more simplistic than they've been in a long time. Beck never goes full pop, but there's a polish to this album that definitely screams radio top 40 to me. And that's before we get a song like Wow, which, I'm just gonna say it, is one of the worst songs on this album, mainly for a beat that is trap-inspired of all things, with some really ugly vocal filters that Beck does not sound comfortable working with. Now, it's not the absolute worst, as you have the incredibly bland I'm So Free, and worst of all, the incredibly embarrassing hook on No Distraction, where the chanting of pull to the left, pull to the left sounds like a dance song that was written in the 40s, back when the hokey cokey was a thing. Now, it does help that Beck is still a good singer, and he still has the charisma and the talent to pull off a lot of this with a straight face. Plus, the album is redeemed by some good songs like the title track, both versions of Dreams, and Dear Life, but ultimately, it's not really enough to elevate this over a strong 5 out of 10. Beck, I absolutely believe that you could make one hell of a pop album, but you need to go back to the drawing board on this one. And who knows, maybe next time you actually will bring some of your own distinctive color to it, rather than this. Here, you want an example on how to do a really damn good pop album?
She loves when everybody's watching. She does the way her body moves. She loves the way they all call back when she says that she loves nobody else but you.
Okay, so if you haven't heard yet, Niall was always my favourite 1D member. But when the band temporarily split up and went their own ways, I'll admit that Niall wasn't the one I was looking out for. Heck, I didn't even know he would go on to make music on his own. Like many others, I was actually waiting for Harry Styles to make a move, so you can imagine my surprise when I heard Niall on the radio first with This Town. A beautiful acoustic ballad that, sure, some called bland, but was also well written and really heartfelt. Plus, when Harry Styles finally did drop that debut solo album, yeah, let's just say that I wasn't quite as wild about it as many other people seem to be. And with Liam and Louis releasing solo material as well now, it's almost like we had the entire band back together spread across different singles in 2017. And surprising me again, Niall actually dropped a full studio album in 2017. And putting aside the ton of requests I was getting to review this, I was definitely going to check this out. So, what did we get on Flickr? Well, to be honest, more than I was expecting. Because believe it or not, I would actually call this a great album. And while I have seen many people, even those who like the album, saying that it's very middle of the road and easy to tune into the background, I would honestly disagree. Because yeah, against all odds, this might just be one of the best albums I've heard all year. And I know, that probably makes absolutely no sense to some of you. After all, the album doesn't exactly tackle complex subject matter or have incredibly detailed writing, but it's the fundamentals here that are so damn solid. The songwriting isn't stellar, but it's definitely above average. The hooks are just amazing. This entire album is ridiculously catchy. Even the single Slow Hands, which I only called decent at first, has really grown on me. And it's saying something about the quality of the rest of these songs that I would still consider Slow Hands to be the weakest song here. For that one dirty laundry line, and the fact that it just feels a little stilted and clumsy. And the best moments here are just great. The mature ballad about letting go of an old flame on This Town, the poetic chorus of Too Much to Ask, the incredibly tight groove of On the Loose, which reminded me of Sugar by Robin Schulz in the best possible way, the unrealistic expectations that were doomed to fail on Paper Houses, the fading spark of the relationship on the title track, all of these are great, far exceeding my expectations for this album. And while many of you will be annoyed at me for rating this higher than Harry Styles or even his Spun, it deserves it, netting an easy 8 out of 10. Well done, Niall, this really is a wonderful debut. See, told you guys that you might get angrier, but wait, we're not done yet.
But
if you mention Yelawolf to many, they will tell you that he's one of the worst ideas that music has had in recent memory. After all, he's a rap and country artist. When has that ever been a good idea? And in a way, I do get what you mean. If you look at the redneck stylings of an act like Kid Rock, you can definitely understand why people don't want to repeat the same mistakes again. Plus, look at acts in the bro country scene who frequently rap, like Sam Hunt and Luke Bryan. With all that said, I think that Yelawolf is an exception to the rule. His 2015 album Love Story, while controversial, was a lot better than I expected. Okay, the production needed some refining and could afford to get a little rougher, but Yelawolf was clearly a great rapper who could spit some impressive bars. And a lot of the hooks on that album, like Heartbreak, Till It's Gone, and especially Empty Bottles, really did stand out to me. That said, while I did see signs of promise, I didn't think that Yelawolf would bring all those elements together on this album. I mean, it's only been 2 years. How can you get that much better in such a short amount of time, especially in a genre which is rarely ever successful? Well, to be honest, this is exactly how. Holy shit, I did not expect this. But listening to this album, not only were the hooks great, not only was the content striking, but the two genres had been blended together in a way that felt incredibly natural. Hell, it works so well that I'd honestly place this above most of the hip-hop and country that I've heard this year. And a lot of that has to do with Yelawolf himself. On his last album, he handled a lot of the hooks himself, which had mixed results. Here, not only is his singing better, but the rest of the hooks are handled incredibly well. Singers like Lee Brice, Winona Judd, Travis Barker, and even Kid Rock all do remarkably well on their songs. Yes, even that last one. Although none of them quite match Joshua Headley, who delivers an incredibly haunting chorus on Shadows, which is one of the darkest and best songs here. And all of them are backed up with phenomenally strong production and songwriting, with a lot rougher and sandier guitars than on Love Story, with touches of piano and fiddles that sound fantastic. Seriously, if Beck's Colors is painfully clean, Trial by Fire is gritty and dirty as hell in the best possible way. And then you have the lyrics, and yet another reason why this album works so well for me. See, on his last album, Yelawolf was definitely going through some shit, but it really didn't feel that visceral or personal a lot of the time. Because the setting, the locations on these tracks was nothing special. This instantly evokes the image of a bar out in the countryside, dusty and rough. There's nothing polished or poised about any of this. And one of the big reasons for that, aside from the great production, is Yelawolf's gift for detail. He goes into many different stories on this album, both reflecting on himself and the people who are living out there in general. From the title track where he's reborn with the spirit of an old western outlaw, to Daylight where he tears himself apart for his alcoholism, to Shadows where he finds himself becoming the things that he grew up fearing, to Row Your Boat where he tears apart everything that corner of the world has allowed to happen, from race-baiting politicians to the KKK, to Son of a Gun where he deals with his abandonment issues concerning his father, and boy is it dark, to best of all the absolutely chilling Sabrina, where a father's frantic inner monologue leads him to the death of his little girl, which gave me flashbacks to Clipping's absolutely jaw-dropping song Story 2, which can only be a good thing. And the more I listened, the more I adored it. This is an album for the ages, one that will be ignored or dismissed by many, but absolutely deserves to be praised for its masterful genre blending, if for nothing else. So, as unexpected as it may be, it's another 9 out of 10, definitely check this out. This is the best combination of two genres that I've heard since the first time I heard Algiers' debut. And while I don't really know where he should go with this sound from here, I'm still absolutely delighted that we got what we did here. Fantastic job, sir. You definitely earned this one. And that's my time, guys. Thanks for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed. I know that, with the exception of St. Vincent, all my opinions in this video are going to be a little contentious, but rather than just berating me, how about we have a conversation down in those comments? You guys are great at asking questions. Feel free to go ahead. Otherwise, if there are any more albums you'd like me to review, please post them in the comments or tweet them at me at The Social Tune, link in the description. Please subscribe so you don't miss a thing, and until the next time, I'm Finn, and this is The Social Tune, signing off.